The anterior compartment of the forearms is generally larger than the posterior compartment. When dissecting the anterior compartment, except for the pronator teres and quadratus, which are not super large, we know the rest of the muscles all contribute to wrist flexion. Some of them have additional functions, but the fact is all of them have been established to have great leverage for pure wrist flexion. For those unaware, leverage, in this case, refers to a muscle's moment arm. The biceps can simply illustrate this. To know a muscle's moment arm, we need to know its line of force and the center of the joint it moves. Then, we simply draw a perpendicular line between these two things to get the muscle's moment arm. Here, we see the biceps has a fairly long moment arm, which tells us it has great leverage and potential to perform its function of elbow flexion, and generally, the longer the moment arm, the better leverage and potential a muscle has to perform movements. Since all these muscles have great leverage for wrist flexion, wrist curling exercises, which involves wrist flexion, will be very effective for training all these muscles. If you could only perform one forearm exercise, some wrist curl would be it, simply because this trains the greatest amount of forearm muscle tissue. Currently, there's no research directly comparing different wrist curl variations for muscle hypertrophy. Despite this, we can hypothesize what the best wrist curl variation might be based on the available literature on other muscle groups. Growing evidence suggests training muscles at relatively longer lengths produces greater hypertrophy than shorter lengths. What on earth does this mean? When we move, our muscles change lengths. For example, the biceps is at a longer length when the elbow is straight, but at a shorter length when the elbow is bent. Two areas of the scientific literature demonstrate the benefits of training muscles at longer lengths: the exercise comparison research and the range of motion research. With the first, one example is this 2021 paper from Japan comparing seated to lying leg curls for hamstrings hypertrophy. The hamstrings consist of 4 muscle heads. All of them cross the knee joint, so are involved in bending the knee, called knee flexion. However, 3 of them also cross the hip joint. This design means these 3 hamstring muscles are going to be stretched more and thus at a longer length when we bend the hip, which is done on seated leg curls. Lying leg curls involve no bend at the hip. It was found seated leg curls grew these 3 hamstring muscles more than lying leg curls, while growth of the biceps femoral short head, which is the one that just crosses the knee and thus is trained at the same muscle length between both exercises, was similar between the 2 exercises. In past House of Hypertrophy videos, we've seen selecting exercises that train the quads and triceps at long lengths can build more muscle. As for the range of motion research, this refers to the joint angles you move through. So with a normal biceps curl, moving the elbow from 0 to around 130 degrees is a full range of motion, but we can divide this into 2 parts. Moving from around 0 to 65 degrees is what we may call a partial at long muscle lengths, while moving from 65 to 130 degrees is what we may call a partial at short muscle lengths. This 2022 study compared calf raises with a partial at longer muscle lengths, partial at shorter muscle lengths, and a full range of motion that moved across all angles. Gastrocnemius hypertrophy was greatest with the partial at long lengths, being even better than the full range of motion. In the spirit of scientific accuracy, we need to recognize this literature on long muscle length training is emerging and developing, and more studies are needed to answer specific questions. For example, is a partial at long lengths always better than a full range of motion? Is there a threshold to the long length needed to maximize muscle growth, beyond which further lengthening provides no further benefits? Finally, all of the research on long muscle lengths for hypertrophy has been done on untrained individuals. Across the web, some suggest there are mechanisms that mean trained individuals would not see greater benefits from training at long muscle lengths. But as I've thoroughly described in this article, I think there are problems with this argument, and we simply need studies on trained individuals. Luckily, there's at least 2 studies in the works exploring if trained individuals benefit from longer muscle lengths. When they're published, I intend to update you with the results at the House of Hypertrophy. Nevertheless, allow us to use this available data to at least speculate on what may be the best forearm exercises. Focusing on the forearm flexor muscles, we know they flex the wrist, so are going to be shortened when the wrist is flexed, but at a more lengthened position when the wrist is extended. With standing wrist curl variations, we don't get into an extended wrist position. Rather, we're largely moving the wrist from neutral to a flexed position. Conversely, with wrist curls that have our forearm resting across a surface with the base knuckles down, our wrist successfully reaches an extended position. Therefore, we may hypothesize this variation may be better for hypertrophy thanks to it attaining longer lengths. This movement can also be performed with your lower arm across a bench or on your thigh. But that's not all. We might be able to make this exercise even better. Recall that the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus, besides flexing the wrist, also flex the fingers. As a result, these two muscles are going to be at a relatively shorter length when the fingers are flexed, but at a longer length when the fingers are extended. Consequently, if we allow the fingers to extend during the wrist curl, we will be able to lengthen the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus even more. Here, we're predominantly extending our fingers at something called the metacarpophalangeal joint while the load rolls down our fingers. We still have some bend in the distal and proximal interphalangeal joints so the load does not fall out. Then, we flex the fingers while simultaneously flexing the wrist to lift the load. We'll call this a finger flexion wrist curl. Here's an example of what this exercise looks like in real life. Some of you might be thinking, what if I just performed wrist curls with fat grips? For those unaware, fat grips are attachments that increase the diameter of the bar you need to grip. Thus, compared to using a normal grip, using fat grips automatically places your fingers into a more extended position. Therefore, when compared to normal wrist curls without fat grips, using fat grips will train the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus at comparatively longer lengths. But when comparing them to finger flexion wrist curls, they generally don't attain as much finger extension, so finger flexion wrist curls generally still achieves longer lengths for the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus. Making the speculative assumption this extra lengthening is beneficial for growing them more, this could be quite an important thing, because the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus are actually the two largest forearm muscles, so play a large role in your overall forearm size. You may be wondering, by introducing this finger flexion into our wrist curl, although this may enhance the stimulus to the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus through placing them at longer muscle lengths, does this not compromise the stimulus to the other forearm flexor muscles? My best guess is probably not. Although this is not an identical comparison, recall we saw this study comparing seated to lying leg curls. Seated leg curls lengthened 3 hamstring muscles more and grew them more, but it was no less effective for growing the biceps femoris short head, which is trained at the same length between the two exercises. In the same way, perhaps finger flexion wrist curls effectively grow the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus more, while not being any less effective for growing the other forearm flexor muscles. Now, you're not going to be lifting as heavy as you can compared to other wrist curl exercises, but this likely does not matter. We don't want to make the mistake of thinking that heavier weights means a greater stimulus. A great example of this comes from this 2022 paper from Japan that compared overhead extensions to pushdowns. Due to the precise anatomy of the long triceps head, it is actually trained at a longer length with overhead extensions, and it indeed grew better with this movement even though subjects lifted heavier loads on the pushdowns throughout the study. So this is how I'd rank the different wrist curl variations. Remember, this ranking is based on inferences from the scientific literature on other muscles, so it would be wrong for me to say this is 100% correct. Also, if you dislike or cannot train with any of the best ranked movements throughout this video, and you find it more enjoyable or practical to train with lower ranked movements, that is absolutely okay. Provided you train these movements to or close to failure, you are absolutely still going to experience hypertrophy. The data still shows meaningful hypertrophy in exercises training muscles at shorter positions. I'll also note with standing wrist curls, you can also introduce finger flexion, which places the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus at relatively longer lengths. Of course, since the wrist remains neutral during this, it doesn't reach as long of a length as this variation. A time-efficient way to implement any form of wrist curls into your training is to superset them. Supersets involve you performing 2 exercises back to back and then rest before performing this for however many more sets you desire. Based on the current literature, we at least have evidence implying supersetting exercises that train different muscles is perfectly fine for muscle growth. Generally, Supersetting wrist curls with an exercise that doesn't involve a grip component is probably a sound idea, such as supersetting leg extensions with them, or any of these other options.